Albans, Alex Lanning. And Alex is the only one brave enough to do the chat so far. There we go. Hey, Jason, how are you? Hey, Cynthia. All right, there we go. Lisa Lutz, all the way from Castine, Maine, where it's still winter, I think.
Beautiful part of the world.
It is. Absolutely.
Okay, so it looks like we're still missing Larry from the list here.
Larry can join us.
Okay.
All right, well, so I'm going to welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here with us on our official NEMA 911 Q&A session. I'm very grateful that you're all joining us, and I'm of course grateful for the team. I'm going to give a bit of a background on what the team is all about, in case you're not familiar with the program. NEMA 911 is something that we started this past year with sort of a twofold purpose, recognizing, first of all, that we have a lot of intellectual firepower out there amongst us with folks who are museum professionals that are retired and or sort of senior level folks that are nearing retirement, shall we say, and can bring a lot to the table in terms of offering advice and counsel to folks. The other need that we discovered is that our community very often has emergencies that they are sometimes reticent to talk with their colleagues about because of confidentiality reasons and the like. And we wanted to create sort of, as we're calling it, a rapid response confidential program to talk with somebody on a colleague-to-colleague basis to help tease out some of your questions and issues and problems and help you navigate those difficult situations. So that's what NEMA 911 is all about. Typically, we take cases that they've really kind of run the gamut over the past year, but they've been very helpful to the folks that have called in. I'll give a little more detail about how to access the program a little bit later in the webinar. But we thought this would be a great opportunity during this time of crisis to sort of be a little more public with it, to offer an opportunity to gather our NEMA 911 team together to be able to talk with you all directly and offer a little bit of advice on the fly during a webinar. Of course, it doesn't have the confidentiality component, so obviously you're talking with a lot of your colleagues, but this is an opportunity to talk very generally, I think, with folks that have been in the trenches over the course of time. So with us today, let me just give a little bit of a shout out to each one of the folks on the call with us, the panelists. We have Wendy Lull, who's the former president and CEO of the Seacoast Science Center in Rye, New Hampshire. We have Charlie Brown, who's the former executive director of the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium and Museum, I forget, in St. Albans, Vermont. We have David Ellis, who is the former president and CEO of the Museum of Science in Boston. We have Laura Roberts, who's the current head of Laura Roberts Consulting. Roger Mandel is here. Say hi, Roger. Roger's the former president of the Rhode Island School of Design and a number of other entities throughout the world. And we have on phone Nina Zaneri, who's the current executive director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association in Boston. So this is our crew today, and we've got a nice turnout of folks as well, that many of whom have been associated with NEMA for some time. So I thought what we would do is I'm just going to kick it off with sort of a general question for the group to get the discussion flowing, but I want everybody to be sure to raise your questions during the course of the event. And I'm sorry, yeah, I didn't introduce Heather. Heather is behind. Well, Heather, keep your video on. That's fine. Heather Riggs is from our staff. She's going to be helping triage the questions. Oh, and so to raise your questions, we've got a chat box that you can use to sort of talk amongst yourselves and with us. But if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your toolbar to actually ask your questions, because it's a little easier for us to pull those out. Ask those questions during the course of our conversations. Interrupt anytime you want to, and Heather will make sure that we've got everybody taken care of. So with that said, I thought I'd just sort of kick this off, and I'm very curious about your impressions, panelists, about how this current situation that we're in right now compares with your experiences in 2008. Now, clearly, some of you are not in museums right now, but certainly reflecting on your experiences in 2008 and what the conversation is, the challenges to leadership, the challenges to our institutions. I'm very curious to kind of get your take on this. A lot of the folks on the call, I'm sure, participating were not around in a leadership position in 2008. So I think that getting a sense of calibration, how serious or how, what lessons we learned back then can be applied to this moment. Who wants to start?
I'll jump in. I think that I was the director of the museum in 2008, and basically we just went tight on everything. But right now, with the market doing what it's doing, with everybody's vulnerable to serious health issues, and because there's no money flowing into many nonprofits, we're in a very, very precarious place where most museums I'm familiar with are now closed and are waiting for the opportunity to reopen because state governors are saying, no, wait, you can't have that many people in the same space. And in fact, a lot of people have been furloughed until those institutions can reopen. And it's sad, and yet it does protect what they can do. And I think the really important question that museum leaders need to be asking themselves now is, how are we going to reopen? How are we going to reboot this institution when, in fact, that wasn't an issue after 2008? We just sort of bounded back to where we'd been.
Mm-hmm. Anybody agree or disagree?
I mean, I think that this is Nina, the voice from who knows where. The real issue, as Charlie said, is that in this instance, we can't fix it ourselves. We're a lot of the places that are closed, and we're closed. The revenue's not coming in. There will be more pressure on fundraising than there was in 2008, I believe, because of all of the need. And I think that the recovery is going to be really slow because the ability to just go in and throw your doors open is not going to be there. We're going to have to be careful. There's going to be fear from people. There may be some pent-up demand, but we're also having to try to figure out how we function in a new reality that may last for the rest of the year and into next year.
At least.
And this is Lauren. I teach in a number of museum studies programs. And in an ordinary recession, enrollments in graduate schools increase because younger people, lower level people lose their jobs. And they figure, well, this is a good time to go back and improve my skills. And in fact, in a Twitter exchange about graduate training in this environment, someone made the observation that the program they were running saw a huge influx of people in 2008 who now, 12 years later, are really wonderful leaders of the field. And so we didn't really have that pipeline crunch out of 2008. This time, boy, are we going to have a pipeline crunch because so many entry-level people are being laid off and losing their jobs. And people are already saddled with so much more student debt now than they were 12 years ago, that I really fear that we're going to end up with almost losing at least half of a generation of workers, if not more. That people are going to be really reluctant to come in. They're going to lose their jobs and they're not going to find new ones, and they're going to go off and do something else. And I think we're going to turn around 12 years from now and wonder where the next generation of leaders is going to come from.
I would,
And I'm expecting, to not teach in the fall, not because Harvard will be closed, but because we won't have sufficient enrollments.
Right. David?
I would add one thing, and that is the importance of thinking about priorities. Priorities in terms of maintaining the key staff that will permit you to open. I don't think it's all or nothing. I think there are differentiations to be made, and the same with respect to financial resources. Obviously, perhaps slowing down on any capital efforts, perhaps looking at, with an extra tough eye, exactly what funds need to be spent during this period and those that don't.
It
So-
is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to recreate the institution in some dimensions, including personnel, but also in how what kinds of investments the organization is going to make, and fundraising. I think is going to look very different coming out of this. It could be positive if it's pitched that way, but it's not going to be positive for everybody.
I know it's a little premature to make any sort of prognostications, it being we're all kind of entering week 4, I think, most of us in this new reality. But what do you see happening right now in terms of sort of short-term changes in behavior, long-term changes in behavior? What do you think is actually going to happen? How will people use museums in the future or behave around museums? Roger?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that because I think that there is going to be, and there is already underfoot, some major changes coming in the museum field. Almost all museums of any consequence now have most of their collections online. Many of them are turning to those aspects of their resources and the staff that they can retain to develop more of an online presence, to keep touch with their members, with people in the public, to develop education programs to supplement the schools that are sending kids home, etc. And I think that it's time for us, as Charlie was beginning to speak about, to rethink in many ways during this sort of quiescent period, and not be so quiescent in thinking about how our institutions are going to play a significant role in the future in our community and nationwide.
Mm-hmm.
I could not agree more, Roger. And I hope that this means that we never have to have another conversation about whether putting our collections online is going to kill live attendance.
I've compared that, by the way, as a footnote to the baseball owners back in the 50s when they started televising baseball games, predicted that nobody was going to show up at the ballpark because they were all televised. And of course, what happened was, the greatest surge of actual demand for their in-person product. So it's certainly an analogy.
And
At
Dan,
least Dan and I know that.
I've always heard that about LP records and symphonic music.
Yeah, and
Actually,
DVDs.
democratized access so that people became more interested in the real thing.
Yeah.
I think the other change that I'm going to see is that while I'm still going to suggest that my students go into development, I'm now going to suggest that they really, really, really work on more than just amateur level social media skills.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The other thing is that we need to take into account becoming a unique resource for information and experiences that can only be seen online. This organization, the board of which I chair now, called DATMA, Design, Art, and Technology Massachusetts, is beginning to plan exhibitions and commission artists for work you can only see online. Mm-hmm. And I think in the science field, there are a number of other things that can be done like that, and other kinds of museums can offer experiences. For example, the number of museums are beginning to, were at the time they were open, beginning to have galleries available in which conservators were working on restoring works of art or objects in general. Well, there are things you can do online with that make it possible to get even closer to what's happening between the conservator and the object that he or she is working on. Mm-hmm. In other words, we need to be much more inventive in the way in which we reach out to people and what we offer them. It's not just about showing them things that already exist.
Do you think that there are some disciplines that are more better positioned than others to adapt to this new reality, art versus history versus science versus children's or whatever?
Well, I can say that certainly for the Seco Science Center, it's a natural history, mostly marine and outdoor education facility. They've done some amazing work with just the living collection. So watching almost any marine critter eat almost anything is always something that gets a lot of views. So I think that's something that's a feature. What I think is going to be something, I don't know how we would do this, but as the organizations that can, and I would just like to acknowledge what Cynthia has done at the Brickstore Museum, a very small, I think you would agree, Cynthia, it's a small institution, has done some really good work with increasing the online presence that they have. And what I wonder about, and have always wondered about with social media, is how do you monetize it? Everyone's so used to it being free. Everything you get online is free. I think that's going to be a big change. And it will have to be something that we have as an industry, but also that you know, how do you get your community to say, wow, I'm so excited that my pre-K child is having this wonderful online experience instead of going to the science center. How do you pay for that? How do you get them to pay for that?
Well, and this moment in time, everybody's doing it for including us,
Right.
you know, and yeah, how do you wean people from that into that pay model? Good question.
I would add that I think there will be greater need than now for working in partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could be part of the monetizing, not the whole answer, but I think it makes sense from all kinds of dimensions.
I think that
How, between museums or between disciplines, or
I'm thinking particularly between a museum and other parties,
oh, okay.
as well as between museums.
yeah, I couldn't agree more, David.
We have a question online there.
Yes.
Yeah,
Heather?
about small institutions.
Come on, Heather, what are you doing here?
So
I'll pose it. Lisa says, Lisa Lutz. Welcome, Lisa. Good to hear from you. Yes, this is all great about online, but don't forget the small museums and historical societies that don't have the funds or staff to do this.
So I would say this, back to, you know, this is a beautiful time of year in Castine, or it's still winter in Castine, which is that it doesn't have to be enormous. It doesn't have to be whole webinars or whatever.
Right.
And I think it can be done by trusted volunteers. So I used to teach at Bank Street College, and we decided we really wanted a robust Facebook presence. And we recruited the alum who was the most active Facebooker, who was really, really on top of particularly arts education, but education stuff in general. And we made him the administrator of our Facebook page.
Mm-hmm.
And that Facebook page is actually one of my go-to sources for cutting edge literature on education generally and education in museums, because we found the volunteer who we could trust to do it. And for the first month or so, we kept better track of what he was doing. But since then, we don't even check in with him. And he doesn't post every day by any means. And in fact, we got an email from him. He's in Florida before the last hurricane saying, just want to tell you, you know, I'm evacuating my family. I may not post for a few days. He said, yeah, it's okay, Marshall. You can not post for a few days. This isn't life and death. So, you know, I think that there are ways to do it that are simple, that your audience cares about, and to enlist members to, you know, be your advocates. I'm the president of the board of a small theater company. And yes, we have a paid marketing person who does post on social media, but every board member knows it's part of their job description to share the theater posts and to like the theater posts and to amplify what our staff is able to do. So it magnifies far more than what we could ever afford to do on our own. We're tiny. We really are tiny as theater companies go.
Nina, do you have something to say here?
Actually, Dan, let me pipe in 1 second. We actually do have a town hall coming up on April 15th. It's going to be on virtual volunteering and public history. So Lisa, you might actually enjoy that one. Alex is actually here with us today. He's going to be hosting that one, and that one's open for everybody to attend.
Cool.
All right, Nina, your turn.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think we all feel both the pressure of doing the social media and doing it well and doing it in a way that's unique. So I usually try to think, at least at our place, about what can we do that's different from someone else. It's the same thing as deciding what your unique proposition is when you go out to fundraise. But I do think that this, and David, you may be onto it, that turning this into actual dollars, I think is the challenge, and whether there's some entrepreneur out there who decides that they will collect and market and then send us the money for our content that's virtual. Any entrepreneurs who want to get on that right now? That's going to help us. It happened with all these companies that started doing audio tours, and then there were companies that were doing other things that most of us hadn't thought about 25 years ago. So there may be an opportunity in this, but if we can't at some point turn it into some dollars, that's going to be a problem, because it can't replace the physical in the door gate receipts.
What do you see happening to admissions in, say the coming 18 months or thereabouts? Are people going to need to drop their admission rates to respect the fact that we're going to be in a recession, if not a depression?
I mean, I think there'll be some of that. I think it's going to be a balance between pent-up demand. I think some will be back to people traveling locally, maybe rediscovering places they hadn't been to. I've seen some of that in other times like this, where people don't want to get on planes and they don't want to travel a long distance, but they do say, hey, I haven't been to the Paul Revere House since I was in 4th grade, let's go. I think we may have to think about promotions. We're thinking about, when we do reopen, adding a little bit to some of our programming to try to draw people in. I think it's going to be a balance of things, and that's what's so hard to plan for. But I don't think anyone should be assuming that their attendance will return. I think at least it's going to take a year, at least.
But I agree. But I think the opportunity to look outside, to look at others, to look at what their needs and interests are, to find out where those entrepreneurs out there are who would like to work with us and with what we have, is a whole area that, by and large, we have not done a lot with. And I think it's an area that opens the door. And the second point, people give money because they care about you, but also, and your mission, but also because you're contributing. And I think we need to sell more how we contribute. I don't mean just economically to the community, but more broadly to education, to the lives of people, including those less well served.
Mm-hmm.
Well put, David.
So a second ago, I asked, do you think one type of museum is better positioned than another, or discipline? Is a museum better positioned to recover if they've got a certain mix of revenue versus another? I'm thinking specifically the prognosis for the tourism industry really stinks, right? I mean, the idea that tourism is going to be down for quite some time. So those museums that are really dependent on tourism income, gate income and the like generally, but tourism specifically from outside, they may be a little bit less able to sustain themselves perhaps. But what is there, a museum that's more inclined to be publicly funded, or a museum that's got more private donations at this point? Where do you think that you know, that fits into the mix, those revenue sources.
So a couple of things, Dan. One is that there are precious few museums in New England that are heavily dependent on out-of-region tourism dollars.
Mm-hmm.
We are not New York City. We are not Washington, D.C. So even someplace like Heritage Museum and Gardens in Sandwich, almost all of their visitation is Massachusetts and Southern New England visitation. They don't see a whole lot of people from, I mean, and then Canada, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think that the vast majority, even of tourist visitors to New England museums, have not gotten off a plane.
Mm-hmm.
They have come by car. Now, it may be different on the Freedom Trail. Nina would know what her numbers are. But so I think for the majority of your visitors, those broad tourism issues are not going to be that big a deal. As Nina says, it's going to be local tourism, people who want to get away for the weekend, and for God's sakes, get out of their houses. I think that obviously the places in our prep phone call, I was reminded that Nina taught me in 2008 that 2008 hit all revenue sources equally, because people didn't have the disposable income. There was so much competition for philanthropy, and your endowments all sank.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to happen again. So I don't think anybody is going to recover faster than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
I think the endowment-based institutions are going to be hit every bit as badly this time around as the gate-funded institutions,
right,
and everything in between. I do think that and Colleen Dillon Schneider's been doing some interesting research, and if you don't follow her blog, you should. And her research indicated that people are going to be reluctant to go to places where they're either tightly packed together or they have to touch something.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And so good news for art museums, good news for historic house museums for a change. The fact that only 10 people come, you know, it'll be good for you. And not so good news for children's museums and hand-on science museums.
So the Please Touch Museum is in trouble?
Right. I don't really want to have the name Please Touch post all of this. I think I would change my name to the Quiet Serene Children's Museum.
Right. Hands Off Museum.
So,
right. Yeah.
And the other thing that those visitors said is that they're much more likely to go to someplace outside.
Right.
So I think that our outdoor living history museums, our parks and things like that will do fine. The other thing in her follow-up survey, the other thing people said is that if the venue is seen to be taking their concerns seriously, that you'll do better.
Mm-hmm.
So that a lesson for coming back, it's not just business as usual. The other day, Becky Billier from Lyman Allen from Florence Griswold suggested we may go to time tickets.
Mm-hmm.
Just so that you communicate to people, we're only letting 20 people in an hour, every half hour, or something to be proactive about answering people's concerns about, am I going to find myself with 100 people all of a sudden?
Right. Roger?
I like that.
I'm going to raise a subject that we have only barely touched on. I think only one person has so far mentioned the word staff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the most critical matters that we have to face, given the potential economic downfall that many museums are going to have to endure, is about the furloughing or the loss of staff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to really try as best we can to plan ways of creating a wider community of support for those staff through the volunteers, through the trustees, et cetera, who could create a broader community to just, if nothing else, along with the leadership of the museum, keep in touch with these people, find out what they need. So are there any critical problems they have? Try to help them find resources if they need them in whatever ways possible.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be more sensitive to those issues, because that staff, which has been so loyal and so hardworking all up to this point, hopefully one would like to see them all return.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just really important that at least on a psychological and personal level, that connection is maintained to create this sense of community.
Yeah. Oh. Nina, do you have something to say?
About staff or tourism, or
Oh,
either?
Yeah, this is free form, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point on staff is well taken. We are keeping our staff on, and we feel pretty comfortable that we can do that for until we reopen, even if it's late in the summer. And we're doing that because we want them to be there when we reopen, because if we lose everyone, we can't reopen. So part of ours is the strategy to make that happen. To the point on tourism, to Laura's point, I mean, I think it is true that at least in New England in general, we have a pretty good amount of tourists that come from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, so drive, able to do it in a drive. I do think that local people will rediscover us. We actually used that phrase the last time this happened. So I do think that people will want to come back, and I do think, again, the point about letting them know when they do come back that you are sensitive to their concerns about being jammed into a space. You continue to make sure that hand sanitizers and various things are available and visible. And I think that is going to help us, but it's still going to be slow. It's going to take some time for those audiences to return. But I do think no matter what your source of revenue, it's going to take a hit.
So let's jump in here with some Q&A. Alex from St. Albans Museum up there in Vermont, near you, Charlie. So Alex said, how do we keep board members, especially those who feel challenged by or do not have access to technology, engaged with our mission, and of course finances, while physical and social distancing? It may be a month or two or more now before we see each other rather than weeks. I'm a solo staffer and our organization needs their support and advocacy more than ever. I also want to balance that with an understanding that some of them may understandably just not have the capacity to serve in any museum role right now.
So thank you for raising board, because I was going to raise the board. A couple of things. As chairman of my board, first of all, our executive committee has been meeting every week by phone, by conference call. And you'd have to have a pretty technologically backwards board to not even be able to handle the conference call. Maybe you do, but we meet by conference call. We meet for an hour. We don't, and if we don't need an hour, but I know exactly, we all know exactly, the four of us know exactly what's going on. If you don't have a strong executive committee, I would create an ad hoc team to be your backup, the president of your board, your treasurer, and maybe one other person, and do that regular check-in, not only to get advice and not only to keep the board on board, but to be an outlet for you as an executive director, because we know you are dealing with horrible, horrible decisions. You're looking at laying people off. You're looking at triaging programs that you've spent a lot of time and energy trying to create. And you need that support. That's why NEMA 911 was created, so that executive directors, particularly the executive directors at small places, would have some backup. That small team can be your backup. And I would say that this is one of those cases where no one else is going to hesitate to ask for money. And if you hesitate to ask for money, it just means you're going to be at the back of the line.
Well, so that, by the way, then Alex had a follow-up question, is how soon is too soon to talk about financial support from the community? Do we keep planning our summer or fall gala? How can we do this in a mindful way when there's so much economic suffering in the context of generational historical public health crisis and so forth? So this is a question that has come up in a couple of other forums as well, which is very interesting, because you do see folks that are now, sort of almost apologetically reminding people that we need funds during this crisis and so forth. But these bigger questions of, like, do we do our gala? How do we continue to reach out and do appeals and that sort of a thing?
So we're doing our gala online. We're doing an ungala. There's no pay to play. We're just delivering content every day and doing the auction. That's where I would drop the price. You asked about dropping ticket prices.
Yeah.
I would drop the gala price.
Right.
I would go for a spaghetti supper rather than a fancy dinner.
Mhm.
I would do something that was more down home and supportive and just bring people together, lower your expectation, but use it as an opportunity to get your people back in the same place in a moment of celebration. And I don't know, Alex, what your ticket price was, but if your ticket price was $50, I would drop it to $25. If it was $100, I would drop it to $50.
David?
Two thoughts. One is that board members, in many cases, have social relationships. And I don't think you have to stop having social relationships all because you can't be at the museum. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be an in-house cocktail party. Maybe it's a Zoom cocktail party, as some people have been having it. But there are ways to talk about and think about how you stay in touch with board members other than just museum business.
Mm-hmm.
Second point for my part is that you got to keep hope out there. You have to present the future. You have to talk about the future in a way that incorporates what we've been through and are going through, but doesn't stop there. What is going to be the plan for the first exhibit when you open, new exhibit when you open, for example?
Good point. You actually stole one of my questions, was how do we communicate hope? That's an important point, because it is a very hopeless feeling situation right now. And we as leaders absolutely have the mandate to be able to package that up a little bit, not false hope, but just transparency with the way things are, but then here's the way things are going to be in our view. Wendy?
Yeah, and the part of your second question, Alex, is that how do you justify asking for funds for a cultural institution when there's so much emphasis on healthcare and homeless shelters and we'll just say social needs. And that has been, I think, a struggle that certainly at the Seco Science Center we used to have a lot. And we'd say, oh, the homeless shelter, and I don't mean to say there's something, I'm not denigrating the homeless shelter. Those guys, because they have, the perfect images for raising money around Christmas time, and even sometimes the animal shelters with the sad-eyed puppy, like, oh no, I have to help. So we used to say, we need a sad-eyed puppy. And we ended up getting our sad-eyed puppy through Marine Mammal Rescue. But more to the point today, I think, is something that I have heard from Larry Yurden at Strawberry Bank, and also from Jim Chase as they're navigating this fundraising. And Larry's point is that these institutions that we run are a huge part of who the community is. And think of how sad it would be to go into Portsmouth or any town where that museum isn't there anymore. Not to terrify people that it's going away, but re-emphasize what value, and it goes back to some of our earlier conversations, what experiences we've had. And Jim said something I thought was really succinct after being on a statewide call in New Hampshire that was mostly social service agencies, but a few other cultural institutions. And he said, well, I listened to all of you, the other social service institutes, and it's true, you're saving lives. But there are institutions that change lives. And as funders are trying to make that decision, where they have X amount of dollars, and maybe it's less than it used to be, but they have some they're going to give. And there's kind of a bad part of me that says, I'm hoping that they'll say, social services are getting a lot. They're getting the federal money. And I know this isn't true, because you can never have enough funding for social services. I understand that. But I'm trying to help us all feel better about, why should I give to a cultural institution? Think about how many children have in your community have benefited from your camps. Think about, and for each institution there'll be something else, but that there is a value to knowing that you have a thriving cultural life within your community, and that is just as important to support and to continue as our physical health.
Right.
And I would say, if you don't have that case to make, you have a bigger problem than the pandemic.
And it doesn't I don't think it has to just be about kids, by the way. I'm sure that because there's a reason that all of the people on this call, all these institutions exist, is that there's something that they do and that they provide that is valuable to that community.
When I do strategic planning, I often say, you know, paint me a picture of this place in 10 years. It used to be the lead in the press release for the local paper, but then there were no local papers. And so we do it in another way. But what do you want to be able to say about this place in 10 years? And I had a client that said, we're still here. And I said, yeah, not good enough. And they said, we've replaced the roof. And I said, really, really not good enough.
Right.
If you don't have a better argument for what it is that you're bringing to the community and the good that you're doing and the impact that you're having, and I'm not joking, you have a bigger problem than the pandemic. You have a total irrelevancy problem, and that's what's going to kill you, not people not being able to afford your gala.
Mhm.
I usually put it a different way to folks, and in the existential standpoint, I always ask the question, if you were to go away, who would shed the first tears? And, you know, sometimes you actually have folks that just sort of puzzle that for a few minutes. They really do not understand or are not fully in touch with who actually cares about the institution to, you know, make it. And, you know, sometimes it's, well, this group of 5 or 6 people that love to come and just putter around and whatever. And, you know, it's sort of, well, that's not good enough. You know, it's like, this is not a sustainable model. Who actually would shed the tears? And that maybe is back to David's point about collaboration and sort of the, you know, notion of how do you fit in with your community, and what is it in fact that you are bringing to this equation? Because if you can find yourself in your community playing that role and building out from, maybe right now you only have the 5 people puttering around, but if you build those relationships, then all of a sudden you have more people that would in fact sustain you in your hour of need, so to speak. And that's the prediction is a good one. We're going to need a lot of support beyond our own immediate walls, I think, in the coming days. So I'm feeling a little bit like a talk show host. Send those questions our way, folks. We're here at 800-555-NEMA. And anyway, so come on and ask your questions. We've got about 15 more minutes or so. One question that I've got for you guys are, do you feel as though there are any best practices that are emerging out of this crisis right now? And, you know, sort of thinking back to the question of 2008, what best practices emerged from that, and what's happening now? I know Zoom as a best practice is certainly happening as we watch, and a lot of this is making it up as we go along. But what things are happening that we're actually going to take away in a few months? It becomes a best practice, because I think everybody's looking to see what everybody else is doing. And, you know, are there any commonalities that you're seeing right now as we're moving forward?
One of the things that we haven't given a lot of attention to in this conversation today, it has come up, but it is your board, and building a board that reaches the entire area that you hope your institution will reach, and perhaps beyond, that reflects the demographic character of your region, and is very obvious. I think David made this point, is that they all have friends and they all have connections, and that's worth it too. But the most important thing is that you have people who are community leaders or regional leaders who really, really are invested in your institution. You get that, and they're going to bring a lot of folks with them. And whether it's a gala or whether it's just kicking the door open, something's got to happen, and you need board members who really buy into that. And the best organizations I've seen have the best boards.
Yeah, yeah. Nina, you had something to say?
I was going to say, I think if one of the best practices, perhaps taking the time to be thoughtful, both thoughtful and full of thought, that stopping before you reach out to a funder and saying, okay, what do I really want to say? What's my message here? How we're dealing with our colleagues. I think a lot of us are reaching out to our colleagues, participating in conference calls, sharing information, perhaps in ways we don't always do because we get in that competitive vein. I hope that this will cause us to rally with our colleagues and with our communities. If you're going to do that spaghetti fundraiser, have the spaghetti restaurant down the street from you do that so that they get something out of it. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a time for us to be a little introspective about how we function in the universe, and hopefully that will bring us out in a more collegial and thoughtful place. Not that we haven't been, but I think this is really forcing us to think about who we are institutionally, how we deal with our staff and our boards. Are we concerned about our staff and how they're doing, our board members and how they're doing? You know, I think there's something positive in that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add to that as a practice that probably a number of you already have, but was helpful to me, and is still being helpful when I think about the groups, smaller groups that NEMA has convened of, so you start to build sort of your crew of other directors that you or colleagues if in your discipline who you really trust and that you can talk to. And I sometimes suggest if you're new in the field or new, is to sort of look around and see if you can find an institution that's similar to yours or sort of what you would like to be, that you really, really respect and are envious of how they're doing whatever it is that they do. Mm-hmm. And then develop a relationship with that person from that institution so that you know you can share each other's joys and sorrows. But I found that to be really helpful. Like, how did they do that? Wait a minute, how come we aren't doing that? And then if you know who the person is, you can say, Charlie, how the heck do you get all those dead animals on those sticks over there? That's what I want to know. All our animals are alive, for God's sake.
Oh, who asked you to be on this webinar, huh?
Yeah.
So, I agree with Wendy 100%, but I disagree with her on one thing, which is that I think that every financial pathway out for every institution is going to be different. Mm-hmm. You know, Nina is able to keep her staff on. God bless you and thank you. There are places that are far more dependent on earned revenue that knew from day one that they were going to be in financial trouble and had to very, very painfully prune away staff. There are places that have significant endowments that were maybe invested very, very conservatively and therefore aren't being hit terribly badly, that are going to be able to make a different decision than Mystic Seaport has had to make, mm-hmm. for example. And I think we need to, I've seen a lot of not being kind to each other about that. I don't think the places that have had to lay off a whole lot of staff are proud of it. And so I think that we each, and I don't want board members to turn to us and say, well, if it was good enough for Mystic Seaport, it should be good enough for you. Lay off 3/4 of the staff. You're gonna have to find your own way out. The best practice is to be thoughtful and to have a really clear financial projection, a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, we don't know when it's gonna end, financial projection that you can stand behind, and then have the backup for when that financial projection doesn't work out the way you thought it would. But everybody's is gonna be different. And that's why it's so challenging, because everyone's financial situation and community situation is so different. And then I guess the other thing, and I think this was also from Becky's ASLH webinar, which is being transparent and being honest. You know, we all know that that rumors fill any void of information, and that, boy, is this a time when rumors would flow into any void. And if you're not seen as being honest and transparent with your staff, your board, your donors, your community, it's going to hurt.
Let me ask you a question.
Already stressed. Your staff and your board are already stressed. Telling them the truth is not going to increase their stress.
Regarding staffing, and this might relate to Roger's point a little bit earlier, but a question of how, well, let's say, I don't want to be judgmental. I was going to say how prudent is it, but you know, I'm thinking about, okay, we're going to need to reopen at some point soon, hopefully. Don't know when that, I mean, soon could be August, which is what I'm hearing people modeling reopenings in August, whether that's realistic or not, might be January, who knows. But at some point we need to reopen. Having your staff in place and kept whole, even though it might come at a cost of convincing the board to perhaps put some of your reserves in or take a bigger draw or whatever the case might be, but trying to keep your staff whole versus furloughing now and then needing to sort of restart the process, you know, to reopen in time. What kind of decisions would be made in a situation like that, especially with, David, I'm going to call on you, in a place like MOS or whatever, bigger place, a lot of employees. Oh, David, sorry, unmute yourself. There you go. Control A. There we go.
One comment, it's not all or nothing.
Okay. Yep.
And I think that is ought to be the fundamental point. As we learn more, that percentage or not, we see coming back, we think it'll be a quick up line or slow one, whether we think it'll be a stepwise thing, all of those things will make a difference, but it's not all or nothing.
Right. Okay. Anybody else agree, disagree? Wendy?
Yeah, when we were facing this previously, what we decided to do was we cut everybody's salary by a percentage, but we also cut their time so that they were paid at the same rate, but not as much. It was a different formula for Vice President and myself, but we're talking about trying to keep as many people whole as possible. And what I found fascinating is that even though we cut their pay instead, and we came up with a formula about, you know, how do you reduce the time across the organization so that there's always adequate staff in the building, blah, blah. People work the same amount of time. And what we realized is that very slowly, it's like, okay, the economy's turning around, and this is going to sound very hard-hearted, Hannah, but it's like people still did a really good job at lower pay. And I'm not saying this is, again, going to work for everybody, but and there really wasn't, except for that, you know, the personal hardship at the time, it didn't cause a lot of problems as far as their productivity or as far as the quality of the products that they serve. Part of that, I think, was that they knew that if they lost this job, there wasn't another one out there.
Right.
That's still true today. And I found, as I received some flack from some board members who felt that taking cuts across the board was not bold enough, that we should cut salary. Couldn't see how that would work at that particular time. But another thing to think about, just as we acknowledge the difficulty of these things for executive directors, is I knew whoever I cut loose there, it could really destroy their families.
Mhm.
And I couldn't look myself in the mirror if I didn't do what I needed to do to keep them whole. In retrospect, I would do the same thing again, but I think I would communicate that a little bit differently. A personal mentor of mine was very cross with me for the salary cut that I took, because he said, "You have just lost the respect of the board. They'll never value you the same way." I don't know if that's true, but it took a very, 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 very long time before my salary was increased. So I'm not saying this to be negative. I'm just giving you some of the experience that I had from before, so that perhaps some of you, if you get into that, you could be ready. But I would still do it to try to help people.
So this segues into a final question. We're about 2 minutes away or so from our hour, and it is sort of the observation of that it's lonely at the top, and understanding that people that are either EDs, CEOs, are in charge of their own departments or whatever the case might be, but there is a certain degree of isolation there. And I guess what sorts of quick words of wisdom do you have for our people on the call today? To how did you handle 2008 personally? How did you sort of get through? How did you what did you rely on to sort of make it from point A to point B? Wendy, you mentioned a mentor, so mentors certainly help. How did you, and of course, wine and all that stuff, that's again.
Yeah, good Scott. Well, I had and have a good support system of colleagues, and it goes back to my other point. You are alone in that moment when you have to make the bad decision or have the bad conversation, but you aren't the only person facing that. And my board chairman at the time had said, "Now, one thing you need to remember, Wendy, is that this is happening to every institution. It's not because you're a lousy manager or that you did anything particularly wrong."
All right. Well, so thank you, Wendy, and everybody participating on the panel. We're all very, very grateful for your time and expertise. I would like to point out, just as a commercial for the program, NEMA 911 is available to any NEMA institutional member, and you can, it's designed for leaders within the organization, whether you're a board member or an ED or department director or whatever, but it's a very loose kind of a thing. We want to make sure that, folks have their questions answered, and, there's a list of disclaimers on our website that sort of lists what it is we do and don't do. We don't give legal advice and so forth, but, for the most part, we entertain and triage anything. It's, again, colleague to colleague. We help you navigate the decision process. We don't solve your problems. It's not consulting and that kind of thing. But, for the folks that have employed us, it seems to have been very helpful. If you want to access it, you go to our website, nemanet.org, and Heather, what's the URL? It's /911.
NEMA 911, I think. Let me go and get it.
Yeah. And you fill out a little form, and it goes to Wendy, David, and Charlie. They're the ER team, we call them, the emergency room doctors. And then we've got OR doctors, specialists, including Laura and Roger and Larry Yerden and Nina and so forth, that we triage this out to. So it's, we certainly welcome to be able to help all of you guys. out there. So thanks very much. Appreciate it. There was a question about whether this is going to be recorded. The answer is yes, it will be recorded, or it is recorded, and we're going to post it to our website. It's going to be where, Heather, on our YouTube site, and then also linked from our own website, nemanet.org.
Yep, so all of our webinars and everything have been recorded, and the links are just under the webinar section under conference and events.
Okay,
And
very cool.
Heather posted that Becky's doing a session for you on April 14th.
Yes.
Yeah,
And as someone who sat through her ASLH session, I recommend it very highly.
great.
Yeah, no, she's definitely a great presenter. She knows what she's talking about. I would encourage everybody to attend one of those at some point.
Right. So thank you, panelists, for your service. Thank you for everybody being on with us. Join
Thanks,
us next
everybody.
time.
Great to see you.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.